The humid Louisiana air, thick with the cloying sweetness of magnolia blossoms and the fecund scent of the Mississippi River, was the only inheritance Alara had ever known. It clung to her skin, a constant reminder of her place in the world, a world confined to the sprawling sugarcane plantation of Belle Reve, the beautiful dream. But for Alara, it was a dream from which she could never awaken. A gilded cage where the bars were forged from love as much as from bondage. Her skin, the color of warm honey, and her eyes, a startling shade of hazel that shifted with the light, were a testament to her mixed heritage, a visible secret that everyone at Belle Reve knew, but none dared to speak aloud. She was the daughter of the master, Elias Fairchild, a man whose passion for his prize quadroon mistress, a woman long since passed, had been both a blessing and a curse upon their only child. Alara's world was one of stark contrasts. She lived in the main house, not in the cramped and squalid quarters of the other enslaved people. She wore dresses of fine muslin and silk, hand-me-downs from her half-sisters, Elias's legitimate white daughters, but they were altered to fit her willowy frame by her own nimble fingers. She could read and write, a skill Elias himself had taught her in the quiet solitude of his library, the heavy scent of old leather and his cheroot smoke her constant companions. He had filled her head with the words of Shakespeare and Milton, with tales of ancient Greece and Rome, yet she could not sign her own name to a legal document, could not own the very books she so cherished. Her days were spent in a peculiar limbo. She was not a field hand. Her delicate hands spared the brutal labor of the cane fields. Nor was she a common house servant, though she was expected to be at the beck and call of her mistress, Elias's wife, a woman whose piety was as sharp and cutting as the sugarcane leaves. Mistress Genevieve, a woman of impeccable breeding and brittle beauty, saw Alara as a living, breathing testament to her husband's infidelity, a constant affront to her own fragile pride. Her words were often laced with a venom that no amount of honeyed magnolia could sweeten. "Alara, fetch my smelling salts," she would command, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that carried the weight of her displeasure. "And do try not to look so much like your mother. It is most unbecoming." Alara would simply nod, her gaze downcast, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had no memory of her mother, only the stories Elias would tell her in hushed tones when Genevieve was otherwise occupied. He spoke of a woman with a spirit as fiery as her auburn hair, a woman who had captivated him with her beauty and her intelligence. But in the telling, his voice would often crack, his eyes growing distant, and Alara knew that he mourned not only the woman he had loved, but also the daughter he could never truly claim as his own. Her half-sisters, Charlotte and Amelia, were a study in contrasts. Charlotte, the elder, was as cold and unyielding as her mother, her words often dripping with a condescending pity that was far more galling than outright cruelty. Amelia, on the other hand, possessed a gentler nature, her heart not yet hardened by the rigid social codes of their society. She would sometimes sneak into Alara's small attic room, her eyes wide with a childish curiosity, and ask Alara to read to her from the forbidden books. It was in these stolen moments of shared stories and whispered secrets that Alara found a sliver of solace, a fleeting glimpse of a world beyond the confines of Belle Reve. But even these moments were fraught with danger. If Genevieve were to discover their clandestine meetings, her wrath would be swift and merciless, and so their friendship blossomed in the shadows, a fragile flower in a garden of thorns. As Alara grew from a gangly girl into a young woman of breathtaking beauty, the whispers and stares of the other enslaved people grew more pointed. They saw the favor bestowed upon her by the master, the fine clothes she wore, the soft life she led compared to their own back-breaking toil. They did not see the invisible chains that bound her, the constant fear of her mistress's jealousy, the gnawing loneliness of her existence. She was an outsider in both worlds, too white for the slave quarters, too black for the grand parlor. Elias, for his part, seemed oblivious to the turmoil that churned within his household. He was a man of contradictions, a man who could quote poetry one moment and order a brutal whipping the next. He loved his daughter. Of that Alara had no doubt. She saw it in the way his eyes would soften when he looked at her, in the gentle touch of his hand on her hair, in the expensive gifts he would secretly bestow upon her. A leather-bound journal, a silver locket, a bolt of emerald green silk. But his love was a possessive, selfish thing, a love that sought to keep her close, to possess her as he possessed his land, his horses, his other human property. He saw in her the reflection of the woman he had lost, and in his grief, he failed to see the woman she was becoming, a woman with a mind of her own, a heart that yearned for a freedom he could never give her. And so, Ilara moved through the days at Bel Rev like a phantom, her presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the passions and prejudices that simmered beneath the veneer of southern gentility. She was a slave who was her master's passion, but also his daughter, and the heir he could never name. Her story was a silent symphony of sorrow and longing, a melody that only the rustling leaves of the sugarcane and the mournful cry of the river birds seemed to understand. The scent of magnolia and scorn was the very air she breathed, and with each passing day, she wondered if she would ever find a place where she could finally, truly, breathe free. The main house at Bel Rev was a monument to Elias Fairchild's wealth and taste, a grand two-story affair with towering white columns, a wide, sweeping veranda, and windows that glittered like diamonds in the Louisiana sun. Inside, the rooms were filled with furniture imported from France, with crystal chandeliers that cast a rainbow of light across the polished cypress floors, and with portraits of Elias's ancestors, their stern, unyielding gazes a constant reminder of the legacy he was expected to uphold. For Ilara, this house was both a sanctuary and a prison. She was allowed the run of the place, a privilege not afforded to any other enslaved person. But she was also a captive within its opulent walls. Her days were a carefully orchestrated dance of duty and deception, of servitude and silent rebellion. Her mornings began before the sun had even begun to paint the sky with its fiery hues. She would rise from her narrow bed in her small, sparsely furnished attic room, the only space in the entire house that was truly hers. It was here, surrounded by her precious books and her secret journal, that she could shed the skin of the dutiful slave and be, for a few precious moments, simply Ilara. She would dress in the simple, yet well-made dresses that set her apart from the other house servants, their coarse linsey-woolsey a stark contrast to her soft cottons. Then she would make her way down the back stairs, her footsteps silent on the worn wooden treads, to the bustling kitchen, where the air was thick with the smells of baking bread, sizzling bacon, and brewing coffee. Here she was under the watchful eye of Delphine, the formidable cook who had been at Bel Rev since before Ilara was born. Delphine, a woman whose dark skin was a roadmap of her African ancestry, was one of the few people who showed Ilara any genuine kindness. She would often slip Ilara a warm biscuit or a piece of candied ginger, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a rare smile. But even Delphine kept her distance, aware of the invisible line that separated the master's favored daughter from the rest of the enslaved community. Ilara's primary duty was to attend to Mistress Genevieve, a task that required the patience of a saint and the cunning of a fox. She would prepare her mistress's morning tea, lay out her clothes for the day, and brush her long auburn hair, her hands moving with a gentle, practiced rhythm. All the while, she would endure Genevieve's endless litany of complaints about the humidity, about the insolence of the other servants, about the ever-present ache in her head. "You have your mother's hands," Genevieve would say, her voice laced with a bitter irony. She had a way with hair. It was one of the few things she was good for. Ilara would bite back the retort that burned on her tongue, her heart aching for the mother she had never known, a woman reduced to a series of backhanded compliments and veiled insults. She would simply murmur a soft, "Yes, mistress," and continue her task, her face a mask of serene indifference. The afternoons were often her own, a precious gift of time that she cherished above all else. While Genevieve retired to her room for her afternoon nap, and Elias was out supervising the work in the fields, Ilara would retreat to the one place where she felt a sense of peace, the library. The library was Elias's sanctuary, a room filled with the scent of old paper, leather, and his ever-present cigars. It was here that he had taught her to read, to write, to appreciate the power and beauty of words. And it was here, surrounded by the wisdom of the ages, that Ilara could escape the stifling reality of her life. She would lose herself in the tales of adventure and romance, of faraway lands and courageous heroines. She would devour the works of Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, her heart soaring with Elizabeth Bennet's wit and Jane Eyre's resilience. In these stories, she found a reflection of her own yearnings, her own desire for a life of purpose and passion, a life beyond the confines of Belle Rêve. But even in the library, she was not entirely free. She was always aware of the possibility of discovery, of the disapproving glare of her mistress, or the condescending pity of her half-sisters. And so she would read with a sense of urgency, her eyes flying across the pages, her mind absorbing every word, every phrase, as if her very life depended on it. Her evenings were a different kind of performance. She would often be called upon to read aloud to the family after dinner, her clear, melodious voice filling the parlor as she brought to life the words of Shakespeare or Dickens. Elias would sit in his favorite leather armchair, a glass of brandy in his hand, his eyes closed in contentment. Genevieve would be busy with her needlepoint, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. And Charlotte and Amelia would listen with varying degrees of interest, Charlotte with a bored, world-weary air, and Amelia with a wide-eyed, rapt attention that was a small comfort to Alara's lonely heart. It was during these evenings that Alara felt the full weight of her gilded cage. She was a performer on a stage not of her own choosing, a beautiful, exotic bird in a cage of gold, her songs pleasing to her master's ear. But her wings clipped, her spirit confined. She was surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege, yet she possessed nothing of her own, not even her own self. And as the last of the candles were snuffed out, and the house fell into a heavy, expectant silence, Alara would retreat to her attic room, her heart a tangled knot of gratitude and resentment. She was grateful for the small kindnesses Elias showed her, for the world of books he had opened up to her. But she also resented him for the life he had created for her, a life of unbearable loneliness and unfulfilled longing. She would open her journal, its pages a repository of her most secret thoughts and dreams, and pour out her heart onto the crisp, white paper. She wrote of her yearning for a mother's love, of her desire for a true and equal friendship, of her dreams of a life where she could be judged not by the color of her skin, but by the content of her character. And as she wrote, the scent of magnolia and scorn would drift in through her open window, a constant reminder of the world that held her captive. But in the quiet solitude of her room, with the moonlight as her only witness, Alara would dare to dream of a different world, a world where the bars of her gilded cage would one day melt away, and she would finally be free to fly. In the rigid social hierarchy of the antebellum South, a name was everything. It was a symbol of one's lineage, one's standing in society, one's very identity. For Alara, the absence of a proper surname was a constant, gnawing reminder of her illegitimacy, of her place in the liminal space between the world of the master and the world of the slave. She was simply Alara, a name whispered in the slave quarters with a mixture of envy and contempt, a name spoken in the main house with a carefully modulated tone of condescension. It was a name that carried the weight of her mother's sin and her father's shame, a name that branded her as something other, something less than. Elias, in his own way, had tried to compensate for this lack. He had given her an education that far surpassed that of his own legitimate daughters. He had clothed her in fine fabrics, and he had showered her with gifts that spoke of a deep, albeit conflicted affection. But the one thing he could not give her, the one thing that would have truly legitimized her in the eyes of the world, was his name. To acknowledge her as a Fairchild would have been to shatter the carefully constructed facade of his respectable life. It would have been to admit to a transgression that society, and more importantly, his wife, would never forgive. And so, he loved her in the shadows. His affection a secret, whispered thing, a love that was as much a burden as it was a comfort. The weight of this namelessness pressed down on Alara in countless ways. It was in the way the other servants would avert their eyes when she passed, their silence a more potent form of judgment than any spoken word. It was in the way the white guests who visited Belle Rêve would look at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, their gazes lingering on her light skin and her fine features, their minds no doubt filled with sordid speculations. It was in the carefully worded introductions that Genevieve would make, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the venom beneath. "This is Ilara," she would say. protégé of my husband's. The word protégé would hang in the air, a delicate yet deadly euphemism that spoke volumes. But it was within the confines of her own family that the weight of her namelessness was most acutely felt. With her half-sisters, Charlotte and Amelia, the chasm of their different stations was a constant, unspoken presence. Charlotte, who had inherited her mother's pride and her father's stubbornness, treated Alara with a cool, detached civility that was more wounding than outright hostility. She saw Alara not as a sister but as a rival, a beautiful and accomplished young woman who, despite her lowly status, posed a threat to her own position as the belle of Belle Rêve. "You have a remarkable talent for mimicry, Alara," she would say, her voice tinged with a faint mocking amusement after Alara had finished reading a particularly dramatic passage from Shakespeare. "One would almost think you had some real feeling for the words." Alara would simply smile, a tight, forced smile that did not reach her eyes, and retreat into the sanctuary of her own thoughts. She knew that to engage with Charlotte, to rise to her bait, would be to play a game she could never win. Amelia, on the other hand, was a different matter entirely. She was a gentle, impressionable soul, her heart not yet poisoned by the prejudices of her time. She looked at Alara not with envy or contempt, but with a wide-eyed admiration that was both a comfort and a danger. She would often seek Alara out in the library, her face alight with a childish enthusiasm, and beg her to read to her from the forbidden novels that their mother deemed unsuitable for a young lady's eyes. And in these stolen moments, as the words of Austen and the Brontes filled the air, the barriers of race and class would seem to melt away, and they would be, for a brief, precious time, simply two sisters sharing a secret. But even with Amelia, the specter of their different destinies loomed large. Amelia was destined for a life of privilege and ease, a life of grand balls and handsome suitors, a life as the wife of a wealthy planter. Alara, on the other hand, was destined for a life of servitude, a life where her future was not her own to command, a life where her very body was the property of another. This stark reality was brought home to Alara one sweltering afternoon, as she and Amelia were sitting on the veranda, shelling peas into a large earthenware bowl. A carriage had arrived, and from it had stepped a handsome young man, his face flushed with the heat, his eyes a startling shade of blue. It was William Davenport, the son of a neighboring planter and a suitor for Charlotte's hand. He was a frequent visitor to Belle Rêve, and his presence always sent a flutter of excitement through the household. As he made his way up the steps, his gaze fell upon Alara, and for a moment, his confident stride faltered. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "And who is this lovely creature?" he asked, his voice a low, melodious drawl. Amelia, with the guileless innocence of youth, replied, "This is Alara. She's our sister." The word hung in the air, a shocking, audacious declaration that sent a ripple of tension through the sultry afternoon air. Charlotte, who had just emerged from the house, her face a mask of polite indifference, shot her sister a look of pure venom. "Amelia, you are being ridiculous," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "Alara is a servant, a favored one perhaps, but a servant nonetheless." The cruel words, spoken with such casual disdain, struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. She felt the blood rush to her cheeks, her hands trembling as she continued to shell the peas, her gaze fixed on the bowl in her lap. William Davenport, to his credit, looked momentarily abashed. He mumbled a hasty apology and followed Charlotte into the house, leaving Alara and Amelia alone on the veranda, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. That evening, as Alara lay in her bed, the moonlight streaming through her window, she replayed the scene over and over in her mind. Amelia's innocent declaration, Charlotte's cruel retort, William Davenport's confused yet admiring gaze. It was in that moment that she understood the true weight of her namelessness. It was a brand that marked her as something less than human, a thing to be admired perhaps, but not to be acknowledged, not to be loved, not to be given the simple dignity of a name. And as she drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with a wild, impossible yearning. A yearning for a world where she was not simply Alara, the master's daughter, the nameless slave, but a woman with a name of her own, a woman with a future of her own making, a woman who was free to love and be loved for who she was, not for what she was. The weight of her name, or lack thereof, was a burden she was no longer sure she could bear. The arrival of Mr. Julian Croft at Belle Reve was as unexpected as a summer storm. He was a distant cousin of Elias's from the north, a man of letters and abolitionist sympathies, a fact that he did not bother to hide, much to the consternation of his southern relatives. He was a tall, lean man with a shock of unruly dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed facade of southern gentility. He spoke with a clipped, precise accent that was a stark contrast to the slow, honeyed drawl of the local gentry, and his ideas about the peculiar institution of slavery were as radical as they were, in Genevieve's opinion, utterly scandalous. From the moment he arrived, Julian Croft's presence sent a ripple of unease through the household. Genevieve treated him with a frosty politeness, her disapproval evident in the tight, disapproving line of her lips. Charlotte, who found his northern sensibilities to be boorish and unsophisticated, ignored him as much as possible. Only Amelia, with her insatiable curiosity, seemed to be genuinely interested in their strange, outspoken guest. But it was Alara who found herself most drawn to this enigmatic man from the north. He was the first white person she had ever met who looked at her not as a piece of property, not as a beautiful, exotic object, but as a human being. He spoke to her with a respect and a directness that she had never experienced before. His questions about her life at Belle Reve, both insightful and, at times, deeply unsettling. They would often find themselves together in the library, the one place where they could escape the watchful eyes of the rest of the family. Julian, an avid reader, was in awe of Elias's extensive collection, and he was equally impressed by Alara's knowledge of literature. "You have a remarkable mind, Alara," he said to her one afternoon, as they were discussing a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost. "It is a crime that it should be kept hidden away in this gilded cage." The words, spoken with such quiet conviction, sent a thrill of something akin to hope through Alara's heart. She had never dared to think of her life in such terms, had never allowed herself to dream of a world beyond the confines of Belle Reve. But Julian's words, his very presence, had planted a seed of possibility in her mind, a whisper of freedom that she could not ignore. He told her of the abolitionist movement in the North, of the brave men and women who were fighting to end the scourge of slavery. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and brave conductors who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. He spoke of a world where a person's worth was not determined by the color of their skin, but by the strength of their character. For Alara, these conversations were like a window opening onto a world she had never known existed. She would listen with a rapt attention, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The idea of freedom was a terrifying, exhilarating thing, a concept that was both a distant dream and, for the first time, a tangible possibility. Their conversations did not go unnoticed. Genevieve, her suspicions aroused by the amount of time Alara and Julian were spending together, grew even more watchful, her eyes following them with a cold, calculating gaze. "That man is a dangerous influence," she said to Elias one evening, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "He is filling that girl's head with all sorts of radical nonsense. You must send him away." Elias, who had a grudging respect for his cousin's intellect, but a deep-seated fear of his abolitionist views, was torn. He did not want to alienate his northern relative, but he also could not ignore his wife's warnings. He was a man caught between two worlds, between the traditions of the past and the winds of change that were blowing from the north. The tension in the household grew thicker with each passing day. Julian, for his part, seemed oblivious to the storm that was brewing around him. He continued to seek out Alara's company, their conversations growing more and more personal, more and more dangerous. One evening, as they were walking in the garden, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle, Julian turned to Alara, his eyes filled with a deep, earnest concern. "Alara," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you do not belong here. You are meant for a different life, a life of freedom and purpose. You must leave this place." The words, spoken with such raw, unvarnished honesty, took Ilara's breath away. She had dreamed of freedom, had yearned for it in the most secret corners of her heart. But to hear it spoken aloud, to have it presented to her as a real, achievable goal, was both thrilling and terrifying. "But how?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have nowhere to go. I know nothing of the world beyond Belrev. I will help you," Julian said, his hand reaching out to cover hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "I will help you escape to the north. I have friends, people who will help you. You can start a new life, a life of your own making." The offer was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness of her existence. But it was also a choice, a terrible, life-altering choice. To leave Belrev would be to leave behind everything she had ever known. The comfort of her attic room, the solace of the library, the fragile yet precious bond she shared with her father and her sister, Amelia. But to stay would be to condemn herself to a life of servitude, a life where her dreams would forever be a distant, unattainable fantasy. As she stood there in the moonlit garden, Julian's hand in hers, his eyes searching hers for an answer, Ilara felt as if she were standing on the precipice of a great abyss. And for the first time in her life, she had to choose whether to stay on the safe, familiar ground of her gilded cage, or to take a leap of faith into the unknown, into the terrifying, exhilarating promise of freedom. The whisper of freedom had become a roar in her ears, and she knew that her life would never be the same. The air in Elias Fairchild's study was thick with the scent of old leather, stale cigar smoke, and a palpable, unspoken tension. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of weary resignation. His eyes, the same hazel as Ilara's, filled with a deep, sorrowful pain. Across from him, Ilara stood, her hands clasped before her, her heart a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest. Julian Croft's proposal had thrown her into a state of turmoil. The idea of freedom, once a distant, abstract concept, was now a tangible, terrifying possibility. And with that possibility came a choice that would not only determine her own future, but also have profound consequences for the man who was both her master and her father. Elias had summoned her to his study under the pretense of discussing a new book he had acquired, but they both knew the real reason for this clandestine meeting. The whispers in the household had grown louder, the air thick with suspicion. Genevieve's watchful eyes missed nothing, and she had no doubt reported to her husband the growing intimacy between his protégé and their radical northern cousin. "Ilara," Elias began, his voice low and strained, "I have been concerned about you of late." He did not look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window where the last rays of the setting sun were painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "You have been spending a great deal of time with Mr. Croft," he continued, his words carefully chosen, as if he were navigating a treacherous, unfamiliar terrain. "He is a man of unconventional ideas, ideas that could be dangerous for a young woman in your position." The euphemisms, the carefully constructed phrases, were a familiar dance, a way of speaking about the unspeakable. But tonight, Ilara had no patience for the delicate charade. Julian's words had ignited a fire in her, a courage she did not know she possessed. "He speaks of freedom, Father," she said, her voice clear and steady, the word "father" slipping from her lips with a mixture of love and defiance. "He speaks of a world where I would not be in this position." The word hung in the air between them, a stark, unvarnished truth. Elias flinched as if she had struck him. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, fear, and a deep, wounded love. "Freedom?" he repeated, his voice a harsh, incredulous whisper. "What do you know of freedom, child? You have been sheltered, protected. You have a life of comfort and ease that most of your kind can only dream of. Do you think freedom is a game? A romantic notion from one of your novels? I know that freedom is the right to own my own body, to make my own choices, to have a name of my own," Ilara retorted, her voice rising with a passion she could no longer contain. "I know that it is more than just fine dresses and a comfortable bed. It is the right to be a human being, not a piece of property." The word struck a nerve. Elias rose from his chair, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He paced the room like a caged lion, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "I have given you everything," he roared, his voice echoing in the small, enclosed space. "I have educated you. I have protected you. I have loved you in the only way I know how. And this is how you repay me? By throwing it all back in my face? By listening to the poisonous words of a northern radical who knows nothing of our ways?" His anger was a terrifying thing to behold, but Alara stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. She saw not just his rage, but the fear that lay beneath it, the fear of losing her, the fear of the world that would judge him for his sins, the fear of a future he could not control. "I am grateful for your kindness, Father," she said, her voice softening, but no less firm. "But kindness is not freedom. Love is not ownership. I cannot live my life as a secret, as a constant reminder of a past you are too ashamed to acknowledge." The truth of her words seemed to deflate him. He sank back into his chair, his anger replaced by a weary, profound sadness. He looked at her then, not as a master looking at a slave, but as a father looking at his daughter. And in his eyes, she saw the full weight of his tragic, impossible love. "What would you have me do, Alara?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Set you free? Send you out into a world that will be even more cruel to you than this one? A world where you will be a woman of color, alone and unprotected? Do you think the North is some sort of paradise? They will despise you there as much as they do here. At least in the North, I would have a chance," she said, her voice filled with a desperate, unwavering hope. "A chance to make a life for myself. A chance to be more than just the slave who was her master's daughter." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a reminder of the precious, fleeting moments of a life that was slipping through their fingers. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice heavy with a decision that seemed to age him in an instant. "He must leave," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky outside. "Julian Croft. He must leave Bel Rev at once. He is a danger to us all." Elara's heart sank. She had hoped for a different answer, for a sign that her father understood her yearning, that he would, in his own way, help her find the freedom she so desperately craved. But his fear, his deep-seated attachment to the world he had created, was too strong. "And what of me?" she asked, her voice a small, broken thing. "Am I to remain here, a prisoner in this gilded cage, until you decide my fate?" Elias did not answer. He simply sat there, a solitary, tragic figure, a man trapped by his own passions, a prisoner of his own making. Alara knew then that she had a choice to make. She could submit to her father's will. She could stay at Bel Rev and live out her days in a state of comfortable yet soul-crushing servitude. Or she could take her destiny into her own hands. She could trust in the promise of a stranger from the North. She could risk everything for the chance, however slim, of a life of her own. As she left the study, the scent of her father's cigar smoke clinging to her clothes, she knew that she had made her decision. A father's fear would not be the anchor that held her back. A daughter's choice would be the wind that would set her free. The gilded cage was about to lose its most precious and most rebellious bird. The night was a thick, inky blanket, moonless and starless, the air heavy with the chorus of 1,000 unseen creatures. The croaking of frogs, the chirping of crickets, the mournful hoot of an owl, all of it blended into a symphony of the swamp, a sound that was both familiar and, on this night, deeply unsettling. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. She clutched the small bundle of her belongings to her chest, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Beside her, Julian Croft moved with a quiet, purposeful confidence, his hand a steady presence on the small of her back. He had arranged everything, had laid out a plan that was both audacious and terrifyingly simple. They were to make their way through the cypress swamp that bordered Bel Rev, to a secluded bend in the river where a boat would be waiting to take them north. The decision to leave had been the hardest of her life. The night before her departure, she had crept into Amelia's room, the moonlight casting a silvery glow on her sleeping sister's face. A wave of love and sorrow had washed over her, and she had to fight back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She had left a small pressed flower on Amelia's pillow, a silent, heartbreaking farewell. Her farewell to her father had been equally silent, equally heartbreaking. She had stood outside his study for a long time, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but she could not bring herself to go in. What could she say to him? How could she explain the impossible choice she had to make? And so, she had simply whispered a silent, "Goodbye, Father," and slipped away into the night. Now, as they plunged deeper into the swamp, the familiar landmarks of Bel Rev disappearing behind them, a sense of unreality settled over her. It was as if she were moving through a dream from which she might awaken at any moment to find herself back in her small attic room. But the cold, damp air, the thick, cloying mud that sucked at her boots, the sharp, pungent smell of decaying vegetation, all of it was real. This was not a dream. This was her new reality. "Are you all right, Alara?" Julian whispered, his voice a low, reassuring rumble in the darkness. She could only nod, her throat too tight with fear to speak. She was not all right. She was terrified. She was terrified of the dark, of the unknown dangers that lurked in the swamp, of the men who would surely be sent to hunt them down if their escape was discovered. But she was also filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. They walked for what seemed like an eternity, the darkness pressing in on them, the sounds of the swamp a constant, unnerving companion. Julian, who had spent his youth exploring the woods of New England, navigated the treacherous terrain with a skill that both surprised and impressed Alara. He seemed to know just where to step, just how to avoid the grasping roots and the clinging vines that threatened to trip them up at every turn. At one point, they heard the baying of hounds in the distance, a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through Alara. They were being hunted. Her father had discovered her absence and had sent the slave catchers after them. Julian pulled her behind a massive cypress tree, his body shielding hers, his hand over her mouth to stifle the cry that rose in her throat. They stood there, frozen, for what seemed like an eternity, the sound of the hounds growing closer, their own heartbeats a frantic, thunderous rhythm in the silence. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound of the hounds faded, moving off in a different direction. They had lost their scent. For now, they were safe. They continued on, their pace more urgent now, their senses on high alert. The swamp seemed to come alive around them, its shadows filled with imagined dangers. Alara saw eyes peering at her from the darkness, heard whispers in the rustling leaves, felt the cold, clammy touch of unseen hands on her skin. But through it all, Julian was a constant, calming presence. He held her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and whispered words of encouragement in her ear. He was her guide, her protector, her only hope in this terrifying, uncertain new world. Finally, after what seemed like an endless night, they saw a faint flickering light in the distance. It was a lantern, a beacon of hope in the darkness. They had reached the river. A small rickety boat was tied to the bank, and in it sat a man, his face obscured by the shadows. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a man who risked his own life to help others find their freedom. As Alara stepped into the boat, her legs trembling with exhaustion and relief, she looked back one last time at the dark, menacing silhouette of the swamp. She had made it through the shadows. She had escaped the gilded cage of Bel Rev. But as the boat pushed off into the current, carrying her away from the only life she had ever known, she knew that the shadows of the swamp would follow her for a long time to come. They were a part of her now, a reminder of the price of freedom, of the long, dark journey that still lay ahead. The whisper of freedom had led her into the heart of the swamp, and now, as she sailed towards an unknown future, she could only pray that it would lead her, finally, into the light. The journey north was a blur of fear and exhaustion, a series of clandestine movements under the cover of darkness, of hiding in the cramped, suffocating confines of secret compartments and false-bottomed wagons. Alara learned to live with the constant, gnawing fear of discovery, the ever-present threat of the slave catchers and their baying hounds. She traveled with a small group of other fugitives, their faces etched with the same mixture of hope and terror that she felt in her own heart. They were a silent, somber group, their stories unspoken, their shared goal of freedom the only bond that united them. Through it all, Julian was her rock, her constant companion and protector. He had a way of calming her fears, of reassuring her with a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the dangers that surrounded them. He treated her not as a damsel in distress, but as an equal, a partner in their perilous journey. They spent their days in hiding, in the homes of brave abolitionists who risked everything to help them. These were people from all walks of life: Quakers with their quiet, unwavering faith, free blacks who had made the journey to freedom themselves, white families who believed in the inherent right of all people to be free. In these safe houses, Alara caught a glimpse of a different world, a world where black and white people could sit down at the same table, could break bread together, could speak to one another as equals. It was a world that she had never dared to imagine, a world that filled her with a sense of wonder and a renewed sense of hope. But the journey was not without its hardships. There were times when they went for days with little food or water, their bodies aching with exhaustion, their spirits worn down by the constant fear. There were moments when Alara felt a despair so profound that she thought she could not go on. During one particularly harrowing leg of their journey, they were nearly caught. They were hiding in the back of a wagon, concealed beneath a pile of hay, when they were stopped by a group of slave catchers. Alara's heart froze as she heard the rough, menacing voices of the men, the sound of them searching the wagon, their pitchforks prodding the hay just inches from where she lay. She held her breath, her body rigid with terror, her hand clutching Julian's in a desperate grip. She could feel his own fear, the tension in his body, but also his unwavering resolve. He squeezed her hand, a silent message of reassurance, of courage. And then, just as she thought they were about to be discovered, the slave catchers gave up, their grumbling voices fading as they moved on. They were safe. But the close call had left Alara shaken, her nerves raw, her hope wavering. That night, as they huddled together for warmth in a cold, damp barn, she confessed her fears to Julian, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "I don't know if I can do this, Julian," she said, the words catching in her throat. "I'm so afraid. What if we don't make it? What if they catch us and take me back?" Julian put his arm around her, his touch gentle, his voice a soft, comforting murmur in the darkness. "We will make it, Alara," he said, his words a balm to her frayed nerves. "Look up." He pointed to a small opening in the roof of the barn, and through it, Alara could see a patch of the night sky, a sky that was, for the first time in a long time, clear and filled with 1,000,000 glittering stars. "Do you see that star?" he asked, pointing to a bright, unwavering light. "That's the North Star. As long as we can see that star, we know we are heading in the right direction. It is a symbol of hope, Alara, a promise of freedom. We must never lose sight of it." His words, his simple yet profound act of pointing out the North Star, had a powerful effect on her. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there was a light to guide them, a hope to cling to. From that night on, the North Star became her talisman, her source of strength. Whenever she felt her courage wavering, whenever the darkness threatened to overwhelm her, she would look for that bright, unwavering star, and it would remind her of her purpose, of the freedom that awaited her at the end of her long, perilous journey. Finally, after weeks of traveling, weeks of living in the shadows, they reached their destination. They crossed the Ohio River into the free state of Ohio, and for the first time in her life, Alara stood on soil where she was not considered property, where she was, in the eyes of the law, a free woman. The feeling was so overwhelming that she could not speak. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of a sorrow so deep that it seemed to be a part of her very bones. She had made it. She had followed the North Star to freedom. But as she stood on the banks of the river, the last vestiges of the South behind her, she knew that her journey was far from over. She was a free woman, but she was also a woman without a past, without a family, without a name. The North Star had guided her to a new land, but it was up to her to find her own way in this strange new world. The future was a blank, unwritten page, and for the first time in her life, she held the pen. The city of Cincinnati was a cacophony of sights, sounds, and smells, a world away from the slow, languid pace of life at Belle Reve. The streets were crowded with people of all colors and classes, their faces a mixture of hope, ambition, and a weary resignation. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, of roasting chestnuts, of 1,000 different lives being lived in close, chaotic proximity. For Alara, it was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She had never been in a city before, had never seen so many people in one place. She felt small, insignificant, a stranger in a strange land. Julian had taken her to the home of a Quaker family, the Millers, who were active in the abolitionist movement. They were a kind, gentle couple, their home a haven of peace and tranquility in the midst of the bustling city. They welcomed Alara with open arms, offering her a room of her own, a warm meal, and a kindness that was so genuine, so unconditional, that it brought tears to her eyes. But even in this safe, welcoming environment, Alara felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was no longer a slave, but she was not yet truly free. The chains of her past were not so easily broken. She was haunted by memories of Belle Reve, of the father she had loved and left behind, of the sister she might never see again. And there was the matter of her name. She could not be Alara Fairchild, for that name would tie her to a past she was trying to escape. But she could not be simply Alara, for that was the name of a slave. She needed a new name, a new identity, a name that would be a symbol of her new life. She spent days wrestling with this decision, trying on different names in her mind, but none of them seemed to fit. They were the names of strangers, of people she did not know. One evening, as she was helping Mrs. Miller in her garden, the old woman turned to her, her eyes filled with a gentle, knowing wisdom. "You are like one of my roses, dear," she said, her voice a soft, comforting murmur. "You have been transplanted from a harsh, unforgiving soil, but with a little care and a little sunshine, you will bloom into something truly beautiful." The words struck a chord with Alara. She thought of the wild roses that grew along the banks of the Mississippi, their delicate beauty a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the world around them. And in that moment, she knew what her new name would be. "Rose," she said, the word a soft, hesitant whisper on her lips. "I would like to be called Rose." And so, Alara, the nameless slave from Belle Reve, became Rose, a woman with a new name, a new life, a new future. With her new name came a new sense of purpose. She was determined to make a life for herself, to be more than just a fugitive slave. She had a keen mind, a love of learning, and a desire to help others who had suffered the same fate as she had. Julian, who had stayed in Cincinnati to help her get settled, encouraged her to pursue her education. He introduced her to a group of abolitionists who were starting a school for free blacks, and they were so impressed with her intelligence and her command of the English language that they offered her a position as a teacher. And so Rose, the former slave who had been taught to read in secret, became a teacher, a woman who now had the power to share the gift of knowledge with others. She taught her students to read and write, to think for themselves, to dream of a better future. And in teaching them, she found her own voice, her own strength, her own purpose. But her new life was not without its challenges. The North was not the paradise that she had imagined. Prejudice and discrimination were rampant, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 cast a long, dark shadow over the lives of all free blacks. The fear of being captured and returned to slavery was a constant, gnawing presence. And there was the matter of her heart. Her feelings for Julian had grown from gratitude to a deep, abiding affection. He was her friend, her mentor, her savior. But he was also a white man, a man from a different world, and the social barriers that separated them were as formidable in the North as they had been in the South. They never spoke of their feelings, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a current of emotion that flowed beneath the surface of their everyday interactions. It was in the way he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and a deep, tender affection. It was in the way she would find herself blushing whenever he was near, her heart beating a little faster. But they both knew that a future together was impossible. The world was not ready for a love like theirs. And so they buried their feelings deep within their hearts, their unspoken love a bittersweet secret that was both a source of comfort and a constant, aching pain. One day, a letter arrived for Julian from his family in Boston. His father was ill, and he was being called home. The news of his departure was a blow to Rose. She could not imagine her life without him. He had been her guide, her protector, her only link to the world she had left behind. The day he left, they stood on the platform of the train station, the air filled with the hiss of steam and the clatter of departing trains. The words they wanted to say, the feelings they wanted to express, remained unspoken, trapped in the space between them. "You will be all right, Rose," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known." "I would not be here if it were not for you," she replied, her own voice trembling. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and firm. "Write to me," he said. "Let me know how you are." And then, with a last lingering look, he was gone, swallowed up by the crowd of passengers boarding the train. As the train pulled away from the station, Rose stood on the platform, a solitary, forlorn figure. She had a new name, a new life, a new purpose. But she was also alone, her heart filled with an unrequited love for the man who had set her free, but who could never truly be hers. The North Star had led her to freedom, but the path ahead was still uncertain, and for the first time since she had left Bel Rev, she felt truly, utterly alone. Years passed. Rose, once the timid, uncertain fugitive, had blossomed into a confident, respected member of Cincinnati's free black community. The school where she taught had flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and learning for the city's colored children. She had found a purpose, a community, a life that was her own. She corresponded regularly with Julian, their letters a lifeline across the miles that separated them. They wrote of their work, of the books they were reading, of the political turmoil that was sweeping the nation. The country was on the brink of war, the issue of slavery a festering wound that threatened to tear the nation apart. But their letters were also filled with an unspoken longing, a subtext of affection that was as clear as the words on the page. They were the letters of two people who loved each other deeply, but who were bound by the conventions of a society that would never accept their love. Rose had made a new life for herself, but the echoes of her past were a constant underlying hum. She often thought of Bel Rev, of the father she had both loved and resented, of the sister whose face was beginning to fade from her memory. She wondered what had become of them, if they ever thought of her, if they even knew she was alive. One day, a letter arrived that was not from Julian. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the postmark from a small town in Louisiana. Her heart pounded as she opened it, a mixture of hope and dread churning in her stomach. The letter was from a man she did not know, a lawyer who had been a friend of her father's. He wrote to inform her that Elias Fairchild had passed away. The news hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had not seen her father in years, had spent so much of her life trying to escape his shadow, but the news of his death left her feeling adrift, unmoored. He was the only father she had ever known, and despite the complexities of their relationship, she had loved him. But it was the rest of the letter that truly took her breath away. The lawyer wrote that Elias, in his will, had done something extraordinary, something that was both a final act of love and a final desperate attempt to right the wrongs of the past. He had left her a substantial inheritance, a sum of money that would make her a wealthy woman. But more than that, he had done something that was almost unheard of in the antebellum South. In a secret addendum to his will, a document that he had entrusted to his lawyer with strict instructions to deliver it to her upon his death, he had acknowledged her as his daughter. The words on the page blurred as tears filled her eyes. "To my beloved daughter, Alara Rose Fairchild," he had written, the name a fusion of her past and her present, a final heartbreaking acknowledgement of who she was. "I leave this inheritance not as a master to a slave, but as a father to a daughter. It is a poor substitute for the name I could never give you, for the love I could never show you openly, but it is all I have to give. May you find the freedom and happiness that I could never provide for you. Forgive me." The letter was a revelation, a key that unlocked a part of her past that she had thought was forever closed to her. Her father had loved her, had acknowledged her, had tried, in his own flawed, imperfect way, to give her the legitimacy he had denied her in life. But the inheritance was also a burden. To accept it would be to accept the money of a man who had owned other human beings, a man whose wealth had been built on the backs of enslaved people. It was a moral dilemma that tore at her soul. And there was another complication. The lawyer wrote that Elias's will was being contested by his wife, Genevieve, and her daughter, Charlotte. They were claiming that he had been of unsound mind when he wrote the will, that he had been unduly influenced by his mulatto mistress's daughter. To claim her inheritance, Rose would have to return to the South, to the very place she had fled in terror so many years ago. She would have to face the woman who had made her life a living hell, the sister who had treated her with such cruel disdain. She would have to step back into the world that she had fought so hard to escape. The thought of returning to Louisiana filled her with a cold, paralyzing fear. But the thought of letting Genevieve and Charlotte steal what was rightfully hers, of letting them erase her father's final act of love and repentance, filled her with a righteous anger. She wrote to Julian, her letter filled with the turmoil of her emotions. She told him of her father's death, of the inheritance, of the impossible choice she had to make. His reply was swift and unequivocal. "Go back, Rose," he wrote. "Claim what is yours. Do not let them win, and know that you will not be alone. I will be with you, every step of the way." His words were the strength she needed. She knew that she had to go back. She had to face the echoes of her past, not as Elara, the timid, frightened slave, but as Rose, the strong, independent woman she had become. She had to claim her name, her inheritance, her identity. The journey south would be a perilous one. The country was on the fire of war, and a woman of color traveling alone in the South was a dangerous proposition. But she was no longer the girl who had trembled in the shadows of the swamp. She had faced her fears before, and she would face them again. The echoes of the past were calling her home, and she would answer their call, not with fear, but with a courage and a determination that had been forged in the fires of her own hard-won freedom. Belle Reve was waiting for her, and she was ready to face whatever ghosts and whatever future awaited her there. The journey back to Louisiana was a surreal experience, a journey back in time to a world that was both achingly familiar and terrifyingly alien. The country was in the throes of the Civil War, and the signs of the conflict were everywhere. The cities were filled with soldiers, the countryside scarred by the ravages of battle. Rose traveled with a constant sense of unease, her heart a tight knot of apprehension. She was a woman of color in a land where her very existence was a crime, a land where the old order was crumbling, but the new one had not yet been born. As she drew closer to Belle Reve, a wave of memories washed over her. Memories of a life that seemed to belong to another person, another lifetime. The scent of magnolias, the sight of the sugarcane fields stretching to the horizon, the sound of the river flowing sluggishly in the humid air, all of it was a powerful, poignant reminder of the world she had left behind. She arrived at Belle Reve unannounced, a solitary, veiled figure in a hired carriage. The house looked smaller than she remembered, its white columns faded, its once pristine gardens overgrown and neglected. The war had taken its toll on the once grand plantation. A house servant, a young woman she did not recognize, answered the door, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I am here to see Mrs. Fairchild," Rose said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her. She was led into the parlor, the same room where she had once read aloud to the family, a performer on a stage not of her own choosing. The room was dusty, the furniture shrouded in white cloths, a funereal air hanging over the once vibrant space. Genevieve Fairchild entered the room, a ghost of her former self. Her auburn hair was streaked with gray, her once beautiful face etched with lines of bitterness and grief. The war and the death of her husband had broken her. She looked at Rose, her eyes filled with a dawning recognition, a look that was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a deep, simmering hatred. "You," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, venomous rasp. "What are you doing here? How dare you show your face in this house?" "I have come to claim what is mine," Rose said, her voice calm and measured. She would not let this woman, this ghost of a painful past, intimidate her. The confrontation that followed was as ugly and as brutal as she had expected. Genevieve, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch, hurled a torrent of abuse at her. She called her a whore, a seductress, a stain on the Fairchild name. She accused her of bewitching her husband, of turning him against his own family. Rose stood her ground, her silence a more powerful weapon than any spoken word. She let Genevieve exhaust her rage, her venom, until she was left a trembling, sobbing wreck. It was then that Charlotte appeared, drawn by the sound of her mother's hysterics. She was no longer the beautiful, arrogant belle of Belle Rêve. She was a woman hardened by war and loss, her face a mask of weary resignation. She looked at Rose with a mixture of resentment and a grudging, unspoken respect. "So you have come back," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I suppose you have come for the money." "I have come for what is rightfully mine," Rose replied, her gaze unwavering. "I have come for the name that my father gave me." The legal battle that followed was a long and arduous one. Genevieve and Charlotte, with the help of a shrewd, unscrupulous lawyer, did everything in their power to discredit Rose, to paint her as a manipulative, opportunistic woman who had taken advantage of a dying man's weakness. But Rose had a powerful ally on her side. Julian, true to his word, had hired a lawyer for her, a man who was both a brilliant legal mind and a staunch abolitionist. And he had come to Louisiana himself, his presence a constant source of strength and support for Rose. He stood by her side in the courtroom, his quiet, unwavering belief in her a shield against the slings and arrows of her accusers. His presence did not go unnoticed. The sight of a white man from the north openly supporting a woman of color was a scandal in the small provincial town. The whispers and stares followed them everywhere they went, but they faced the prejudice with a quiet, defiant dignity. The trial was a spectacle, a microcosm of the larger conflict that was tearing the nation apart. It was a battle between the old South and the new, between the forces of tradition and the winds of change. Rose was called to the stand, and as she stood before the court, her voice clear and steady, she told her story. She spoke of her life at Belle Rêve, of her father's kindness and his cruelty, of the gilded cage in which she had been raised. She spoke of her yearning for freedom, of her escape to the north, of the life she had made for herself. She did not speak with bitterness or resentment, but with a quiet, dignified grace that commanded the respect of even her most ardent detractors. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. And then, her lawyer produced the secret addendum to Elias's will, the letter in which he had acknowledged her as his daughter. The words, read aloud in the silent, crowded courtroom, were a bombshell, a final, irrefutable testament to the truth. In the end, the court had no choice but to rule in her favor. Rose, the former slave, was declared the legal heir to a portion of the Fairchild fortune. She had won, but her victory was a hollow one. Belle Rêve was a shadow of its former self, its land fallow, its coffers empty. The war had destroyed the plantation economy, and the Fairchild fortune was all but gone. The inheritance was not a fortune in gold, but a legacy of debt and decay. But for Rose, it was more than enough. She had not come back for the money. She had come back for her name, for her identity, for the acknowledgement that she was, and always had been, a Fairchild. As she stood on the veranda of the old dilapidated house, the setting sun casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn, she felt a sense of closure, of peace. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. The echoes of her past had been silenced. She was no longer a slave, no longer a fugitive, no longer a nameless, faceless woman. She was Rose Fairchild, and she was, at long last, free. With the legal battle behind her, Rose was faced with a new set of choices. She was now the mistress of a ruined plantation, a woman of means in a world that was still struggling to define the meaning of freedom. She could have sold Belle Rêve, taken her inheritance, and returned to the north, to the life she had made for herself in Cincinnati. But something held her back. The land, the house, the river, they were a part of her, a part of her story, and she felt a sense of responsibility to the other people who had been enslaved at Belle Rêve, the people who were now, like her, free, but who were also lost, adrift in a world that had not yet made a place for them. And so she made a radical, audacious decision. She would stay at Belle Rêve. She would use her inheritance to rebuild the plantation, not as a monument to the past, but as a beacon of the future. She would turn the land into a cooperative farm, where the former slaves could work for themselves, could own a piece of the land they had once tilled as property. She would turn the main house into a school, a place where their children could receive the education that had been denied to them for so long. It was a bold, ambitious plan, and there were many who thought her a fool. The white community was outraged, her former neighbors scandalized by the idea of a woman of color, a former slave, presiding over a grand plantation. The newly freed blacks were skeptical, their trust in the promises of white people, even a woman who looked like them, eroded by centuries of betrayal. But Rose was undeterred. She had a vision, a purpose, and she had Julian by her side. He had stayed in Louisiana, his plans to return to Boston indefinitely postponed. He had become her partner, her confidant, her staunchest ally. He helped her with the legal and financial aspects of her plan, his practical northern sensibilities, a perfect complement to her idealistic vision. They worked side by side, from sunrise to sunset, their days filled with the hard, rewarding work of building a new world from the ashes of the old. They were a team, a partnership, a force to be reckoned with, and as they worked, the unspoken love between them grew deeper, stronger, more undeniable. It was in the way they would look at each other across a crowded room, a silent, secret communication that no one else could understand. It was in the way their hands would brush against each other as they worked, a simple, fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through them both. But the love that bound them together was also the wall that kept them apart. The world was not ready for a love like theirs. A relationship between a white man and a woman of color, even in the post-war South, was still a taboo, a transgression that would have jeopardized everything they were trying to build. And so they continued their silent, heartbreaking dance, their love a beautiful, tragic secret that they both cherished and mourned. One evening, as they were sitting on the veranda, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the conversation turned, as it often did, to the future. "What will you do, Julian?" Rose asked, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Will you ever go back to Boston?" He was silent for a long time, his eyes searching hers, his face a mixture of love, longing, and a deep, profound sadness. "My place is here, Rose," he said, his voice a low, emotional whisper. "With you, in whatever way you will have me." The words were a declaration, a confession, a plea. He was offering her his heart, his life, his future, and she knew, in that moment, that she loved him more than she had ever loved anyone. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy and of sorrow. She wanted to say yes, to throw her arms around him, to tell him that she wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of her life with him. But she also knew the cost of such a decision. Their love, if made public, would be a scandal, a weapon that their enemies would use to destroy them, to destroy everything they were trying to build. And so, she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She smiled, a sad, beautiful smile that did not reach her eyes, and she reached out and took his hand. "You are my dearest friend, Julian," she said, her voice trembling. "I could not have done any of this without you, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." It was not the answer he had been hoping for, but it was the only answer she could give. He understood. He had always understood. He squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Then I will stay," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "As your friend, always." And so, they made their choice, a choice born of love and of sacrifice. They would be friends, partners, soulmates. They would build a new world together, a world where others could be free to love as they could not. Their love would remain unspoken, a beautiful, tragic melody that would be the soundtrack of their lives. It was a love that was as deep and as wide as the river that flowed past Belle Reve. A love that was as constant and as unwavering as the North Star that had once guided Rose to freedom. It was a love that was, in its own way, a testament to the very freedom they had fought so hard to create.